Joining yourself. I'm your host, Sarah. Tonight we're going to do part two in our series, uh, illuminating the history of the situation that's occurring in the so-called Middle East, um, Palestine, Israel, Canaan, which was the original name of the land. We left off from the book last time, the 13th tribe, but I'm not going to go right into that book right away. We'll get back to it. I have a book that we're going to start with, which I think will provide a really good context for our discussion, and then we'll circle back to the book, the 13th tribe, and then back to this book. So I'll read into the record the name of the book that we'll be starting with. That book is called Facts Are Facts. And this book is a compilation of a speech and a letter that was written by Benjamin H. Friedman, the first part of the book I'll read from, he's given a speech. And then in the second part that I'll be reading from, he's writing, has transcribed a letter to an individual named David Goldstein. So the beginning of the book gives a brief description of who Benjamin H. Friedman, the author of the book, is. And it says, Benjamin Friedman speaks. A Jewish defector warns America. And so this is an introduction into who Benjamin H. Friedman is before he goes into his speech. So I'll read the introduction. It says, Benjamin H. Friedman was one of the most intriguing and amazing individuals of the 20th century. Now, and before I continue, I just want to just put things in context. Okay, we're dealing with this now, because of the powdercade that we are observing in the so-called Middle East, the war that's going on currently between the Israelis and the Palestinians through Hamas, who they elected as their government or governing authority. But a lot of people aren't aware of the history and why there is such conflict in that area. And so it's important to be able to go into the history in order to be able to get a good understanding and perspective of why things are so contentious there. And we'll see that the analogy is very similar to a scenario wherein one leaves from vacation from one's home and returns only to find someone occupying their house. And then upon naturally asking the intruders to leave. They refused to leave and instead make the offer to allow the owners of the house to have a part of it, to settle in their own house. I would suggest that if it were you, you would not consider that to be an equitable deal. And I'll just leave that there. Okay, so we're going into the book Facts Are Facts, written by Benjamin H. Friedman. And so we're reading again the from the introduction, where they're describing who Benjamin H. Friedman is. Benjamin H. Friedman was one of the most intriguing and amazing individuals of the 20th century. Mr. Friedman, born in 1890, was a successful Jewish businessman of New York City who at one time was the principal owner of the Woodbury Soap Company. He broke with organized Jewry after the Judeo-Communist victory of 1945 and spent the remainder of his life and great preponderance of his considerable fortune, at least $2.5 million, exposing the Jewish tyranny which had enveloped the United States. Mr. Friedman knew what he was talking about because he had been an insider at the highest levels of Jewish organizations and Jewish machinations to gain power over our nation. Okay, so Benjamin Friedman, indeed, was himself what he would refer to as a so-called Jew. Those aren't my words. So it says, Mr. Friedman knew what he was talking about because he had been an insider at the highest levels of Jewish organizations and Jewish machinations to gain power over our nation. Mr. Friedman was personally acquainted with Bernard Baruch, Samuel Untermeyer, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Joseph Kennedy, and John F. Kennedy, and many more movers and shakers of our times. This speech was given before a patriotic audience in 1961 at the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., on behalf of Conde McGinley's patriotic newspaper of that time, The Common Sense. And he considers this speech a warning. So I'm going to read some excerpts from the speech. I'm not going to read the whole speech, but we'll read the most salient parts of the speech. So I'm moving ahead in the book, and we'll start. What's this? Page 17 of the introduction, and that's 17 in the in Roman numerals in the book, Facts Are Facts. And Mr. Friedman says, "What are the facts about the Jews? I call them Jews to you because they are known as Jews. I don't call them Jews myself." Mind you, Mr. Friedman was himself a so-called Jew. He says, "What are the facts about the Jews? I call them Jews to you because they are known as Jews. I don't call them Jews myself. I refer to them as so-called Jews because I know what they are. The Eastern European Jews, who form 92% of the world's population of those people who call themselves Jews, were originally Khazars. They were a warlike tribe who lived deep in the heart of Asia. They were so warlike that even the Asiatics drove them out of Asia into Eastern Europe, which is key. They set up a large Khazar kingdom of 800,000 square miles. At the time, Russia did not exist, nor did many other European countries. The Khazar kingdom was the biggest country in all Europe, so big and so powerful that when other monarchs wanted to go to war, the Khazars would lend them 40,000 soldiers. That's how big and powerful they were. They were phallic worshippers, which is filthy, and I don't want to go into the details of that now, but that was their religion, and it was also the religion of many other pagans and barbarians elsewhere in the world. The Khazar king became so disgusted with the degeneracy of his kingdom that he decided to adopt a so-called monotheistic faith, either Christianity, Islam, or what is known today as Judaism, which is really Talmudism. I would give my editorial analysis of this part because actually this isn't true, and we will eliminate that when we go into the book, The 13th Tribe, which will describe actually how the choice was made. But he is correct to say that he considered the three religions of the Khazar king. That'll come back to me. So the Khazar king considered the three religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, which Friedman referred to as Talmudism. He says by spinning the top and calling out eeny, meeny, miny, mo, he picked out so-called Judaism, and that became the state religion. He sent down to the Talmudic schools of Pumbedita and Sura and brought up thousands of rabbis and opened up synagogues and schools, and his people became what we call Jews. There wasn't one of them who had an ancestor who ever put a toe in the Holy Land, not only in Old Testament history, but back to the beginning of time. Not one of them. And yet they come to Christians and ask us to support their armed insurrections in Palestine by saying, you want to help repatriate God's chosen people to their promised land, their ancestral home, don't you? It is your Christian duty. We gave you one of our boys as your Lord and Savior. You now go to church on Sunday and you kneel and worship a Jew and we're Jews. But they are pagan Khazars who were converted just the same as the Irish were converted. He goes on to say, these Khazars, these pagans, these Asiatics, these Turco-Finns, were a Mongoloid race who were forced out of Asia into Eastern Europe. Because their king took the Talmudic faith, they had no choice in the matter. Just the same as in Spain, if the king was Catholic, everybody had to be a Catholic. If you had to get out of Spain, if not, you had to get out of Spain. So the Khazars came what we call today Jews. I'll skip ahead. Okay, so those are the salient points from the introduction. So I just wanted to put that on the record that that Mr. Friedman, who considered himself a so-called Jew, recognized that the people who refer themselves as Jews, who make up 92% of the world's population of Jews, have no historical connection to that area, the so-called homeland, Palestine, or Canaan. Okay. So I'm going to skip over now into the 13th tribe, as I mentioned, and there we're going to get a little bit more detail about who the Khazars were. Okay, so we're in the book, The 13th Tribe, written by Arthur Koestler. And here he's making reference to a book written by D.M. Dunlop, who was also a researcher and expert on the Khazars, and I do have that book as well. So quoting from D.M. Dunlop on the history of the Khazars, he says, the Khazar country lay across the natural line of advance by the Arabs. Within a few years of the death of Muhammad, AD 632, the armies of the Caliphate sweeping northward through the wreckage of two empires and carrying all before them reached the great mountain barrier of the Caucasus. This barrier once passed, the road lay open to the lands of Eastern Europe. As it was on the line of the Caucasus, the Arabs met the forces of an organized military power which effectively prevented them from extending their conquests in this direction. The wars of the Arabs and the Khazars, which lasted more than 100 years, though little known, have thus considerable historical importance. The Franks of Charles Martel on the field of Tours turned the tide of the Arab invasion. At the same time, the threat of Europe in the east was hardly less acute. The victorious Muslims were met and held by the forces of the Khazar kingdom. It can scarcely be doubted, but for the existence of the Khazars in the region north of the Caucasus, Byzantium, the bulwark of European civilization in the east, would have found itself outflanked by Arabs, and the history of Christendom and Islam might very well have been different from what we know. It is perhaps not surprising, given these circumstances, that in 732, after a resounding Khazar victory over the Arabs, the future Emperor Constantine V married a Khazar princess. In due time, their son became Emperor Leo IV, known as Leo the Khazar. A few years later, probably AD 740, the king, his court, and the military ruling class embraced the Jewish faith, and Judaism became the state religion of the Khazars. No doubt their contemporaries were as astounded by this decision as modern scholars were when they came across the evidence in the Arab, Byzantine, Russian, and Hebrew sources. One of the most recent comments is to be found by the Hungarian Marxist historian Antal Bartha, his book on the Magyar society in the 8th and 9th centuries has several chapters on the Khazars, as during most of that period the Hungarians were ruled by them. Yet their conversion to Judaism is discussed in a single paragraph of obvious embarrassment. Our investigation cannot go into the problems pertaining to the history of ideas, but we must call the reader's attention to the matter of the Khazar kingdom's state religion. It was the Jewish faith which became the official religion of the ruling strata of society. Needless to say, the acceptance of the Jewish faith as a state religion of an ethnically non-Jewish people could be the subject of interesting speculations. We shall, however, confine ourselves to remark that this official conversion, in defiance of Christian proselytizing by Byzantium, the Muslim influence from the East, and in spite of the political pressure of these two powers, to a religion which had no support from any political power, but was persecuted by nearly all, has come as a surprise to all historians concerned with the Khazars, and cannot be considered as accidental, but must be regarded as a sign of the independent policy pursued by that kingdom. It says, what is in dispute is the fate of the Jewish Khazars after the destruction of their empire in the 12th or 13th century. On this problem, the sources are scant, but various late medieval Khazar settlements are mentioned in the Crimea, in the Ukraine, where another war is currently ensuing. So he says, Khazar settlements are mentioned in the Crimea, in the Ukraine, in Hungary, Poland, and Lithuania. The general picture that emerges from these fragmentary pieces of information is that of a migration of Khazar tribes and communities into those regions of Eastern Europe, mainly Russia and Poland, where at the dawn of the modern age, the greatest concentration of Jews are found. So here they're saying that after the collapse of the Khazar kingdom, that the people of Khazars populated and settled in the Crimea, in the Ukraine, in Hungary, Poland, and Lithuania, and the lands of Russia and Poland. Okay, it says this, and these areas are where it says where at the dawn of the modern age, the greatest concentrations of Jews were found. This has led several historians to conjecture that a substantial part, and perhaps the majority, of Eastern Jews, and hence of world Jewry, might be of Khazar and not of Semitic origin. Might be of Khazar and not of Semitic origin. Why is that important? Well, what happens when one starts speaking any truth about the history of the Jews, or is critical of any kind of actions that Jews engage in? If anyone criticizes Zionism as being racist, or points out that Israel's a settler colony, or anything to that effect, they are labeled with the moniker of anti-Semite or anti-Semitism. But here it says, this has led several historians to conjecture that a substantial part, perhaps the majority, of Eastern Jews, and hence of world Jewry, might be of Khazar and not of Semitic origin. It says the far-reaching implications of this hypothesis may explain the great caution exercised by historians in approaching this subject, if they do not avoid it altogether. Thus, in the 1973 edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica, the article Khazars is signed by Dunlop, but there is a separate section dealing with Khazar Jews after the fall of the kingdom, signed by the editors and written with the obvious intent to avoid upsetting believers in the dogma of the chosen race. Okay, it says, how important in quantitative terms is that presence of the Caucasian sons of Japheth in the tents of Shem? One of the most radical propounders of the hypothesis concerning the Khazars' origins of Jewry is the professor of medieval Jewish history in Tel Aviv University, A.M. Polyak. His book, Khazaria in Hebrew, was published in 1944 in Tel Aviv, and a second edition in 1951. In his introduction, he writes that the facts demand a new approach, both to the problem of the relations between the Khazar Jewry and other Jewish communities, and to the question of how far we can go in regarding this Khazar Jewry as a nucleus of the large Jewish settlement in Eastern Europe. The descendants of this settlement, those who stayed there, who stayed where they were, those who immigrated to the United States and to other countries, and those who went to Israel constitute now the large majority of the world Jewry. It goes on to say, this was written before the full extent of the Holocaust is known, but does not alter the fact that the large majority of surviving Jews in the world is of Eastern European and thus perhaps mainly of Khazar origin. If so, this would mean that their ancestors came not from the Jordan, but from the Volga, not from Canaan, but from the Caucasus, once believed to be the cradle of the Aryan race, and that genetically they are more closely related to the Hun, Uighur, and Magyar tribes than the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Should this turn out to be the case, then the term anti-Semitism would become void of meaning based upon a misapprehension shared by both the killers and their victims. The story of the Khazar Empire, as it slowly emerges from the past, begins to look like the most cruel hoax which history has ever perpetuated or perpetrated. Okay, we're going to skip ahead a little bit, and here's some information by chroniclers who wrote about the Khazar kingdom, who were contemporary to those times. It says, as to the Khazars, an Arab chronicler writes, they are to the north of the inhabited earth towards the seventh clime, having over their heads the constellation of the plough. Their land is cold and wet. Accordingly, their complexions are white, their eyes blue, their hair flowing and predominantly reddish, their bodies large and their natures cold. Their general aspect is wild. A Georgian chronicle, echoing an ancient tradition, identifies them with the hosts of Gog and Magog, wild men with hideous faces and the manners of wild beasts, eaters of blood. An Armenian writer refers to the horrible multitude of Khazars with insolent, broad, lashless faces and long falling hair like women. Lastly, the Arab geographer Ishtakiri, one of the main Arab sources, has this to say: the Khazars do not resemble the Turks. They are black-haired, and there are two kinds. One called the Kara Khazars, black Khazars, who are swarthy, verging on deep black as if they were a kind of Indian, and a white kind, Ak Khazars, who are strikingly handsome. It says the Khazar language was supposedly a Chuvash dialect of Turkish, which still survives in the autonomous Chuvash Soviet Republic between the Volga and the Sura. The Chuvash people are actually believed to be descendants of the Bulgars, who spoke a dialect similar to the Khazars. All we can say with safety is that the Khazars were a Turkic tribe who erupted from the Asian steppes, probably in the 5th century of our era. So, origin of the name Khazar is most likely derived from the Turkish rune gas, to wander. So if these derivations are correct, it would show that the Khazars had a considerable impact on the imagination of a variety of people in the Middle Ages. Another Arab historian named Yaqubi, who was a 9th century historian, traces the origin of the Khazars back to Japheth, the third son of Noah. The Japheth motive recurs frequently in the literature, while other legends connect them with Abraham or Alexander the Great. Another Syriac chronicle by Zechariah Rhetor, dating from the middle of the 6th century, mentions that the Khazars in the list mentions the Khazars in a list of people who inhabit the region of the Caucasus. Other sources indicate that they were already much in evidence a century earlier and intimately connected with the Huns. And a historian named Priscus says that the Khazars appeared on the European scene about the middle of the 5th century as a people with Hunnish sovereignty and may be regarded together with the Magyars and other tribes as a later offspring of Attila's horde. That would be Attila the Hun. Okay, but before becoming a sovereign state, the Khazars still had to serve their apprenticeship under the short-lived power of the so-called West Turkish Empire. Turk was used to apply to a specific nation as distinct from other Turkic-speaking peoples like the Khazars and Bulgars. The Khazars had been under Hun tutelage, then under Turkish tutelage, and after the eclipse of the Turks in the middle of the 7th century, it was their turn to rule the kingdom of the north, as the Persians and Byzantines used to call it. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a bit. It talks a little bit about the war between the Muslims and the Khazars, and how the Khazar Empire originated. It says the Muslims were beaten back on every occasion in this first phase of the Arab-Khazar War. The last time in 652, in a great battle in which both sides used artillery, catapults, and ballistae. 4,000 Arabs were killed, including their commander, Abdul Rahman ibn Rabi'a. The rest fled in disorder across the mountains. And they didn't attempt any further incursions into the Khazar stronghold. The Khazars, in the meantime, having subjugated the Bulgars and the Magyars, completed their western expansion into the Ukraine and the Crimea. This was considered to be a positive development by the Roman Empire because it put a halt to the expansion of the Muslim incursion into Europe. So it says the sigh of relief experienced in the Roman Empire assumed a tangible form through another dynastic alliance when the heir to the throne was married to a Khazar princess whose son was to rule Byzantium as Leo the Khazar. Okay, and that's confirms what was written in the previous book. Okay, the king of Khazar is referred to as the Kagan. And it says the Kagan was forced to ask for terms. Let's see. And this was in response to another incursion by the Arabs into their territory. And it was a surprise attack. And so the initial response was to try to negotiate a settlement. And the Kagan was the king of Khazar. The Kagan was forced to ask for terms. Marwan, in accordance with the routine, followed another conquered territories requested the Kagan's conversion to the true faith. The Kagan complied, but his conversion to Islam must have been an act of lip service, because that's never spoken of again in the history. Yeah. So we'll skip ahead again. To just put into context the nature of the land of Khazar. It says Khazaria was the first feudal state in Eastern Europe, which ranked with the Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantine Empire being basically the Roman Empire, led by the Roman Catholic Church and the Arab Caliphate, which was the head of Islam. Okay. It says the main contribution of the Khazars to world history was their success in holding the line of the Caucasus against the northward onslaught of the Arabs. Okay, so we're going to skip ahead. It says from the chronological point of view, the next event to be discussed should be the conversion of the Khazars to Judaism around 740 AD. Okay, and the sources of this are different Muslim sources who recorded some of the events that occurred. And I'll just kind of summarize what occurred, and then we'll read a bit into the, from the book. But to summarize, the Kagan, the king of Khazar, was being visited by representatives of the Muslim Caliphate and by representatives from the Byzantine Empire, and they were both trying to convince the Kagan, the king of Khazars, to convert to their respective religions. Now, in the course of time, it happened that they were also visited by a number of people who practice the Talmudist religion, as Friedman referred to it, and we'll go into the history of those people shortly. And so the people who were Talmudists took refuge in Khazar, and including some of their rabbis and scholars. And so as they were being approached by representatives of the Caliphate, the Muslim Caliphate, and the Byzantine court, or the Roman Catholics, to convert, they were also being pitched conversion to Talmudism, or what we would refer to now as Judaism. Okay, and so here is some discussion about that. This is in the book of Ahmad ibn Fadlan ibn al-Abbas ibn Rashid ibn Hamad, an official in the service of Muhammad ibn Sulayman, the ambassador of the Caliph al-Muqtadir to the king of the Bulgars, in which he relates that he saw in the land of the Turks, the Khazars, the Rus, the Bulgars, the Bashirs, and others, their very kind of religion, the history of the kings, and conducts in many walks of life. And he asked him therein to send him someone to give him religious instruction and acquaint him with the laws of Islam, to build him a mosque and a pulpit so that he may carry out his mission of converting the people all over his country. So, so these are, a missionary sent from the Caliphate to try to convert the Kagan. And, as we discussed, they did not have a religion at the time, and, they were practiced paganism. We're going to skip ahead a little bit more. So the Byzantine emperor forced the Jews to immigrate. These immigrants came into the Khazar country. So that's where I was saying that some of um, the practitioners of Talmudism began to migrate into the Khazar region. Okay, so I'm going into chapter 2 of the book, and that starts on page 58 of the 13th tribe. It says, the religion of the Hebrews had exercised a profound influence on the creed of Islam, and it had been a basis for Christianity. It had won scattered proselytes, but the conversion of the Khazars to the undiluted religion of Jehovah is unique in history. At the beginning of the 8th century, the world was polarized between two superpowers representing Christianity and Islam. Their ideological doctrines were welded to power politics pursued by the classical methods of propaganda, subversion, and military conquest. The Khazar Empire represented a third force, which had proved equal to either of them, both as an adversary and as an ally. But it could only maintain its independence by accepting neither Christianity nor Islam, for either choice would have automatically subordinated it to the authority of the Roman emperor or the Caliph of Baghdad. So, as the Caliph, the Kagan of Khazar was considering the different religions, he came to the recognition, as they pointed out here, that, well, if I convert to Christianity, that would put me in subordination to the Roman emperor, and if I convert to Islam, that would put me in subordination to the Caliph of Baghdad. And so, as I pointed out, there were some Talmudist rabbis and scholars who had begun to settle in the land of Khazar, and so he was also learning about Judaism from them. And so he was considering all three and came to the realization that neither the Roman Catholic Church or the Roman Emperor or the Caliph of Baghdad had any sway over Judaism, and it was independent of the two. And he, wanting to be recognized as a power and not be a subordinate to anyone, made the choice to convert to the religion of Judaism along with his country. So it says, at the same time, their intimate context with Byzantium and the Caliphate had taught the Khazars that their primitive shamanism was not only barbaric and outdated compared to the great monotheistic creeds, but also unable to confer on the leaders the spiritual and legal authority which the rulers of the two theocratic world powers, the Caliph and the Emperor, enjoyed. Yet the conversion to either creed would have meant submission, the end of independence, and thus would have defeated its purpose. What could have been more logical than to embrace a third creed, which was uncommitted towards either of the two, yet represented the venerable foundation of both? The apparent logic of this decision is, of course, due to the deceptive clarity of hindsight. In reality, the conversion of Judaism required an act of genius. Yet both the Arab and Hebrew sources on the history of the conversion, however varied in detail, point to a line of reasoning as indicated above. To quote Burry once more, there can be no question that the ruler was actuated by political motives in adopting Judaism. To embrace Mohammedanism would have made him the spiritual dependent of the caliphs, who attempted to press their faith on the Khazars. And in Christianity, they had the danger of becoming an ecclesiastical vassal of the Roman Empire. Judaism was a reputable religion with sacred books with both Christian and Mohammedan respected. It elevated him above the heathen barbarians and secured him against the interference of the caliph or emperor. Though the Khazar court conversion was no doubt politically motivated, it would be absurd to imagine that they embraced it overnight. So it took them, a while to fully adopt it, but they converted. They indeed did. And it points out, like I was saying before, that they had been well acquainted with the Jews and their religious observances for at least a century before the conversion, through the continued influx of refugees from religious persecution in Byzantium, and to a lesser extent, the countries in Asia Minor conquered by the Arabs. And so due to some religious persecution by the Roman Church, as I pointed out, some Jews had, quote unquote, so-called Jews, began to migrate into Khazar. Okay, so it says, although the implementation of the order seemed to, let me go back. Persecution in varied forms had started with Justinian I and assumed particularly vicious forms under Heracles in the 7th century, Leo III in the 8th, Basil and Leo IV in the 9th, Romanus in the 10th, and thus Leo III, who ruled during the 2 decades immediately preceding the Khazar conversion to Judaism, attempted to end the anomaly of the tolerated status of Jews at one blow by ordering all his Jewish subjects to be baptized. Although the implementation of the order seemed to have been rather ineffective, it led to the flight of a considerable number of Jews from Byzantium, and thus many Jews took flight from the country of the Greeks to Khazaria. Okay. Is there anything else I want to read from this book? I'll just briefly read this part here just to put things in context. It says the Crimea, as we have seen, intermittently under Khazar rule, also had an old established Jewish community, and the inscriptions may even predate the conversion. And I wanted to put that in there too because I want to establish that Talmudist Jews settled in these areas, which now are the Crimea, Ukraine, and Russian territory, Poland, as we read into the record earlier. Okay. I think. Okay. Yeah. So I think that's enough that we need to read from this book. And so now we're going to move back to the book Facts Are Facts by Benjamin H. Friedman. And I am going to begin reading Just bear with me for a minute. So we're going to start reading from the letter that Benjamin Friedman wrote to this individual, Dr. David Goldstein. Okay, we're not going to read all of it. We're going to read excerpts from it, which I've highlighted here. Okay, it says, and just to put things in context, he's writing to Dr. Goldstein because Dr. Goldstein apparently was what would be considered a Jew, but he had converted to Catholicism. And he apparently was a respected theologian. It says, "You are a theologian of high rank and historian of note." Um, and he's appealing to him to understand the history of the what he refers to as the so-called Jews, and he wants him to understand that as he's teaching his people and trying to convert people to Christianity, he wants to dispel the notion that Christians should support the settlement of what he refers to as so-called Jews into Palestine. Okay, so we're reading from like part of the beginning of the letter, and he says, "Without any fear of contradiction based upon the fact of the most competent and best qualified authorities, all agree today that Jesus Christ was not a so-called or self-styled Jew. They now confirm that during his lifetime, Jesus was known as a Judean." And so he's making a distinction between and illuminating the point that Jew, the word Jew, did not exist during that time, the time of Jesus' life, and that he was known as Judean, not as a Jew, because he said that term did not exist. Okay, and so he goes on to say, in the time of Pontius Pilate, in history there was no religious, racial, or national group in Judea known as Jews, nor had there been any group so identified anywhere else in the world prior to that time. Okay, and I'm going to skip ahead. He says, "It is an incontestable fact the word Jew did not come into existence until the year 1775. Prior to 1775, the word Jew did not exist in any language. The word Jew was introduced into the English for the first time in the 18th century when Sheridan used it in his play." It says Jesus is referred to as a so-called Jew for the first time in the New Testament in the 18th century. Jesus first referred to as a so-called Jew in the revised 18th century in the English language of the 14th century first translations of the New Testament into English. The history of the origin of the word Jew in the English language leaves no doubt that the 18th century Jew is the 18th century contracted and corrupted English word for the 4th century Latin Iodus, found in St. Jerome's Vulgate edition. Of that there is no longer doubt. He goes on to identify the different iterations of and origins of the word Jew, from the Latin Judaeus, U, spelled G-Y-U, U, or Jew, G-Y-U, G-I-U. Note that in those times there was no J, so it would have been either G-Y-U, G-I-U, G-I-U, or just I-U, and other derivations. Okay, so it goes on to say, The King James Authorized Translation of the New Testament into English began in 1604 and first published in 1611. The word Jew did not appear in it either. The word Jew appeared in both these well-known editions in their 18th century revised versions for the first time. Okay. I'm going to skip ahead in the letter again. And it says, there is not a person in the whole English-speaking world today who regards a Jew as a Judean in the literal sense of the word. So he goes on to say again, during the time of Jesus, he was not referred to as a Jew, that he was a Judean. And that, so that would be, he's saying, is the proper term. He says there's not a person in the whole English-speaking world today who regards a Jew as a Judean in the literal sense of the word. He says that was the correct and only meaning in the 18th century. The generally accepted meaning of the word Jew today, with practically no exceptions, is made up of four almost universally believed theories. These four theories are that a so-called or self-styled Jew is, one, a person who today professes the form of religious worship known as Judaism, a person who claims to belong to a racial group associated with the ancient Semites, 3, a person directly the descendant of an ancient nation which thrived in Palestine in Bible history, and 4, a person blessed by divine intentional design with certain superior cultural character denied to other racial, religious, or national groups, all rolled into one. It says countless intelligent and informed Christians no longer accept unchallenged assertions by the Christian clergy that Jesus in his lifetime was a member of a group which practiced a religious form then which is today called Judaism, or that Jesus in his lifetime here on earth was a member of the racial group which today includes the preponderant majority of all so-called or self-styled Jews in the world, or that so-called or self-styled Jews throughout the world today are the lineal descendants of the nation of Judea, of which Jesus was a national in his lifetime here on earth, or that the cultural characteristics of so-called or self-styled Jews throughout the world today correspond with the cultural characteristics of Jesus during his lifetime on earth and his teachings while he was here on earth for a brief stay. Christians no longer believe that the race, religion, nationality, and culture of Jesus and the race, religion, nationality, and culture of so-called or self-styled Jews today are the ancestors of common origin or character. I'll skip on to page 26 where he says, and this is actually, if one reads the Bible, you will be able to confirm this as a Christian, if you're so inclined. But the Bible does confirm what he just says here. It says, Jesus abhorred and denounced the form of religious worship practiced in Judea in his lifetime, and which is known and practiced today under his new name, Judaism. That religious belief was then known as Phariseeism. Okay, and you'll recall, those of you who have actually read the Bible, that Jesus was often at war with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and considered them to be violators of the law. So So it says the eminent Rabbi Louis Finkelstein, the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, often referred to as the Vatican of Judaism, in this foreword to the first edition of the world-famous classic, The Pharisees, the sociological background of their faith, on page XXI or 21 states, Judaism, Phariseeism, okay, again, this is written by Rabbi Louis Finkelstein, who is the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is considered to be the Vatican of Judaism, says in his book, The Pharisees, the sociological background of their faith, Judaism, ... Phariseeism became Talmudism. Okay, that's why he refers to the Judaists or Jews as Talmudists as opposed to Jews, or Judaism or Talmudism as opposed to Judaism. So the rabbi says Judaism, Phariseeism became Talmudism. Talmudism became medieval rabbinism. Okay, rabbinism coming from the word rabbi, who put together the Babylonian Talmud, which is the code and laws that dictate the life of the Talmudists or Judaists. It says Talmudism became medieval rabbinism, and medieval rabbinism became modern rabbinism. But throughout these changes in name, the spirit of the ancient Pharisees survived unaltered. From Palestine to Babylonia, from Babylonia to North Africa, Italy, Spain, France, and Germany, from these to Poland, Russia, and Eastern Europe, generally, ancient Phariseeism has wandered, demonstrates the enduring importance which attaches to Phariseeism as a religious movement. The celebrated Rabbi Louis Finkelstein, in his great classic, quoted from above, traces the origin of the form of religious worship practiced today under the present name Judaism to its origin as Phariseeism in Judea at the time of Jesus. Rabbi Louis Finkelstein confirms what the eminent Rabbi Adolf Moses states in his great classic, Yahvism and Other Discourses, in collaboration with the celebrated Rabbi H.E. Enlau, published in 1903 by the Louisville section of the Council of Jewish Women, in which Rabbi Adolf Moses on page 1 states, among the innumerable misfortunes have befallen the most fatal among the innumerable misfortunes which have befallen, the most fatal in its consequences is the name Judaism. Worse still, the Jews themselves, who gradually come to call their religion Judaism. Yet neither in biblical nor post-biblical, neither in Talmudic nor in much later times, is the term Judaism ever heard. The Bible speaks of the religion as Torath Yahweh, the instruction of the moral law revealed by Yahweh in other places, as Yireh Yahweh, the fear and reverence of Yahweh. And he points out that it was Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, who first coined the term Judaism. But before that, such a term did not exist. It says, hence the term Judaism coined by Josephus remained absolutely unknown to them. It was only in comparatively recent times, after the Jews became familiar with modern Christian literature, that they began to name their religions Judaism. Yeah, so the Flavius Josephus, it says, on page 28, the Flavius Josephus referred to in the above quotation lived in the 1st century. It is he who coined the term Judaism in the 1st century explicitly for the purpose recited clearly above. Religious worship known and practiced today under the name Judaism by so-called or self-styled Jews throughout the world was known and practiced in Judea in the name at the time of Jesus under the name Phariseeism, according to Rabbi Louis Finkelstein, who was the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary. The religious worship known as Phariseeism in Judea in the time of Jesus was a religious practice based exclusively on the Talmud. The Talmud in the time of Jesus was the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all rolled into one of those who practiced Phariseeism. And I'll mention that there were 2 Talmuds, one called, I believe it was the Palestinian Talmud, and the other was the Babylonian Talmud. And check me on the first one, and we'll find. Because I'm not sure about the first name, but we'll get it. But the first one, or excuse me, one of the 2 is the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, so the role the Talmud plays in Judaism as it's practiced today is officially stated by the eminent Rabbi Morris N. Kurtzer, the Director of Interreligious Activities of the North American Jewish Committee and the President of the Jewish Chaplains Association of the Armed Forces of the United States, in his present capacity as official spokesman for the American Jewish Committee, the self-styled Vatican of Judaism. Rabbi Morris N. Kurtzer wrote a most revealing, and comprehensive article with the title, "What is a Jew?" which was published as a feature article in Look magazine in the June 17, 1952 issue. If you're so inclined, look that up. In that article, Rabbi Morris N. Kurtzer evaluated the significance of the Talmud to Judaism today. In that illuminating treatise on that important subject, the most qualified authority at the time, Rabbi Morris N. Kurtzer, stated, the Talmud consists of 63 books of legal, ethical, and historical writings of the ancient rabbis. Okay, so remember, the rabbinical that Finkelstein mentioned, or rabbinism. Okay, so the Talmud consists of 63 books of legal, ethical, and historical writings of the ancient rabbis. It was edited 5 centuries after the birth of Jesus. It is a compendium of law and love. It is the legal code which forms the basis of religious law, and it is a textbook used in the training of rabbis. And it goes on to say, in his History of the Talmud, Michael Watkinson on page 70 states, is the literature that Jesus was familiar with in his early years yet in existence in the world? Is it possible for us to get at it? Can we ourselves review the ideas, the statements, the modes of reasoning and thinking, or moral and religious subjects which was current in his time and must have been evolved by him during those 30 silent years when he was pondering his future mission? To such inquiries, the learned class of Jewish rabbis answered by holding up the Talmud. Here, they say, is the source from whence Jesus of Nazareth drew the teachings which enabled him to revolutionize the world. And the world in question, and the question becomes, therefore, an interesting one to every Christian. What is the Talmud? The Talmud, then, is the written form of that which in the time of Jesus was called the traditions of the elders, and to which he makes frequent allusions. Now, he'll go on, the book will go on to say that suggestion is completely ridiculous, because as was pointed out, the Talmud was written uh, 5 centuries, I believe it was, and we'll check that, after the death of Jesus. Okay, and so to confirm that, I skipped to page 31 in the book. It says, um, so what possessed them to make this translation into English? Um, and so they translated the Talmud into English, and so he's making the question as to what the why did they translate it into English? So let me go back a bit. Okay, I'll read this into the record. And again, this is not my opinion. This is the opinion of Mr. Friedman. He says from the birth of Jesus until this day, and he's basically making his observations about the Talmud. He says from the birth of Jesus until this day, there have never been recorded more vicious and vile, libelous blasphemies of Jesus, of Christians and the Christian faith by anyone, anywhere, or any time that you will find between the covers of the infamous 63 books, which are the legal code, which forms the basis of Jewish religious law, as well as the textbook used in the training of rabbis. The explicit and implicit irreligious character and implications of the contents of the Talmud will open your eyes as they have never been opened before. The Talmud reviles Jesus, Christians, and the Christian faith as the priceless spiritual and cultural heritage of Christians has never been reviled before or since the Talmud was completed in the 5th century. Okay, so here it says the Talmud was completed in the 5th century. So again, as I pointed out, Jesus supposedly died in the 1st century. And so here you see the Talmud was compiled in the 5th century, at least 400 years after the death of Jesus. So it could not have been, as was stated here, that the Talmud is the written form of which, in the time of Jesus, was called the tradition of the elders, and to which he makes frequent allusions, because he couldn't have made any allusions to it because it didn't exist at that time. Okay, so he goes on to say that the original 63 books of the Talmud were first composed by their authors in many lands between 200 BC and 500 AD, with it being completed around 500 AD, again, well after the death of Jesus. There's other sections which I won't read, where he gives examples of some of the things that are written in the Talmud. I won't read them here. That may be for another time. And the reason I'm not is because it's like the excerpts are not flattering. We'll just leave it there. Okay. I'll just mention this. He makes reference to a vow called the Kol Nidre, which is significant in that it's a vow that he alleges that the so-called Jews invoke annually, and it is a vow which basically disavows previous vows that had been taken. Okay, and so he goes on to translate the Kol Nidre. It says, all vows, obligations, oaths, and anathemas, whether called konum, konus, or by any other name, which we may vow or swear or pledge, or whether we may be bound from this day of atonement to the next, may be deemed absolved, forgiven, annulled, and void, and made of no effect, and they shall not bind us, nor have power over us. The vows shall not be reckoned vows, the obligations shall not be obligatory, nor the oaths be oaths. And it says, and he who desires none, and this is, let's see, the reference made to where this exists in the Talmud is in the book of Nedarim, spelled Nedarim, 23a through 23b, the Kol Nidre. It says, he who desires that none of his vows made during the year shall be valid, let him stand at the beginning of the year and declare, every vow which I make in the future shall be null. His vows are then invalid, providing that he remembers this at the time of the vow. The significance of this is referred to when agreements and treaties have been made in the future, and how when you look back into the history where those agreements have been violated, it points back to this Kol Nidre as the justification. Okay, so I want to skip ahead and say and read from pages further in the book where he says that the so-called or self-styled Jews in Eastern Europe at any time in their history in Eastern Europe were never the legendary lost tribes of Bible lore. That historical fact is incontrovertible. Relentless research established as equally true that the so-called or self-styled Jews in Eastern Europe at no time in their history could be correctly regarded as the direct lineal descendants of the legendary lost tribes of Bible lore. The so-called or self-styled Jews in Eastern Europe in modern history cannot legitimately point to a single ancient ancestor who ever even set a foot on the soil of Palestine in the era of Bible history. Research also revealed that the so-called or self-styled Jews in Eastern Europe were never Semites, are not now Semites, nor can they ever be regarded as Semites at any time in the future by any stretch of the imagination. Exhaustive research also irrevocably rejects as a fantastic fabrication that the generally accepted belief by Christians that the so-called or self-styled Jews in Eastern Europe are the legendary chosen people, so vocally publicized by the Christian clergy from their pulpits. And in the letter, he's establishing a context for us to be able to understand what's going on in the day that he wrote it, and actually provides a segue into understanding what's going on now. Okay, and so he basically, sets it up to demonstrate how these things ended up leading to World War One, World War Two, and what's happening currently. And man, there's so much information. So it looks like we're getting close to running out of time, but there's a lot of good information that we need to get to. And as I said, this looks like it's going to be a series, and it may take maybe a couple of more segments for us to get to sufficiently, but it's important that we do cover it, because I was up actually last night until 1:30 in the morning last night, reading and highlighting this book of what I wanted to cover, and found it worthwhile to do so, because it does do exactly what I just said. It provides key context to understanding how this situation, this history, has led up to the First World War, how it led to the Second World War, and how it formed the basis of the wars that are going on currently now in the Ukraine and currently occurring in Israel, i.e. Palestine. Okay, so Jamal, should I stop now, or do we have time to go a little bit more into this, or should we just pick it up next time? Can we keep going? Okay, 5 more minutes. Okay, so we'll jump ahead. He says, okay, I'll read this last paragraph, and we'll leave it there and pick it up on the next show. So Benjamin or Friedman, I believe it is again. Yeah, Benjamin Friedman, in his letter to Dr. Goldstein, he says, in the year 1948 in the Pentagon in Washington, I addressed a large assembly of the highest officers of the United States Army in the G2 branch of military intelligence on the highly explosive geopolitical situation in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Then, as now, that area of the world was a potential threat to the peace of the world and to the security of this nation. I explained to them fully the origin of the Khazars and the Khazar kingdom. I felt then, as I feel now, that without a clear and comprehensive knowledge of that subject, it is not possible to understand or to properly evaluate what has been taking place since 1917, the year at the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. It is the key to that problem. And I think that's a very appropriate point to end at. And basically, Mr. Friedman basically reiterates what I just said, in that it's important for us to go into this history so that we can have a proper basis for understanding what's currently going on in those regions. So that's what we're doing, and that was what my intention was to do, so that we can be properly informed. And based upon my reading of this, I have to confess that it seems to me that we are on the precipice of World War III. So with that, I think I will go ahead and end this current session, and we'll pick it up from there next time. So I hope that this has been very informative to you, and helps provide some context for understanding. We're going to lay it out strong and put it in its proper perspective by going into this pretty methodically, and and we will have a good understanding of what's happening right now. All right, so hope that this has been informative to you. I do encourage you to get these books if you want to go into it yourself. And so again, the book that I've been reading from is the book called Facts Are Facts by Benjamin Friedman. And then we also read from Arthur Koestler's book, The 13th Tribe. So I encourage you to get those and read those. And again, this book, Facts Are Facts, is a pretty quick read. I pretty much read the whole book yesterday. It was very concise and very informative. I highly recommend you getting it. So thank you for joining. I hope this has been beneficial to you in your understanding, and we'll see you next time here on Journey into Self. Hotel.